You were taught to be kind, to avoid conflict, to always be the good person. But what if that's exactly what's holding you back from everything you actually want in life? You apologize when others bump into you. You say yes to requests that drain your soul, because saying no feels cruel. You smile through conversations that bore you to death because disagreeing might hurt someone's feelings. You've built your entire identity around being nice, agreeable, and non-threatening. But here's something nobody told you about being the good person. Niccolo Machiavelli, history's most misunderstood philosopher, understood a brutal truth that your kindergarten teacher never mentioned. The world doesn't reward goodness, it devours it. While you've been busy being nice, others have been being strategic. While you've been avoiding confrontation, they've been claiming territory. While you've been seeking approval, they've been commanding respect. This isn't about becoming a monster. This is about waking up to the reality that your obsession with being good might be the very thing destroying your self-respect, your power, and your freedom. And if you've ever felt overlooked, used, or silently screaming while wearing a pleasant smile, it's time you learned what. Niccolo Machiavelli didn't write The Prince to create tyrants. He wrote it to reveal the game that everyone else was already playing, while you sat on the sidelines with your moral superiority. Machiavelli had spent his life in politics, watching good men get destroyed by those who understood power's true nature. He saw virtuous leaders overthrown by cunning rivals, honest advisors replaced by skilled manipulators, and noble intentions crushed under the weight of practical reality. Everyone sees what you appear to be. Machiavelli wrote, "Few experience what you really are." The good people of the world live in the appearance, constantly performing virtue for an audience that will applaud you while they take what's yours. But Machiavelli saw deep. He understood that while you're agonizing over whether your actions are nice enough, others are making decisions based on results. While you're seeking consensus, they're creating facts. While you're worried about being liked, they're focused on being respected. And there's a universe of difference between the two. Machiavelli wasn't advocating for cruelty. He was advocating for effectiveness. He understood that good intentions without power to implement them are just pretty thoughts that change nothing. The road to hell, as they say, is paved with good intentions and populated by good people who never learn to be effective people. Meet Alexander, a 29-year-old project manager at a mid-sized marketing firm who has never said no to a request in his professional life. Alexander arrives first and leaves last, volunteers for every thankless task, and spends his weekends covering for colleagues who somehow always have emergencies. His team loves him because he's reliable, accommodating, and never makes anyone feel bad about their mistakes. His manager loves him because he never complains about additional responsibilities or unrealistic deadlines. His clients love him because he apologizes for problems that aren't his fault and works miracles to fix situations others created. Alexander has been Employee of the Month 3 times, has received glowing performance reviews, and makes exactly the same salary he made 2 years ago. Because while everyone loves Alexander, nobody respects him. He's the workplace equivalent of a doormat. Beautiful, functional, and completely taken for granted. When promotions come available, they go to colleagues who demand what they want instead of hoping someone will notice their dedication. When interesting projects need leaders, they choose people who speak up confidently rather than those who wait politely to be asked. Alexander watches this pattern repeat endlessly, each time telling himself that his turn will come, that good people eventually get rewarded, that karma will balance the scales. But deep down, in moments of honest reflection, usually at 2 a.m. when insomnia strikes, Alexander knows the truth: being good isn't getting him what he wants. It's getting him exactly what he's willing to settle for, which is apparently very little. Alexander's compulsive goodness isn't actually about being moral. It's about being safe. Somewhere in his childhood, Alexander learned that being good earned love, that being agreeable avoided conflict, and that being needed provided security. His mother praised him when he shared his toys, even when it made him miserable. His teachers favored him when he never caused trouble, even when it meant accepting injustice. His father, emotionally distant unless Alexander was achieving, taught him that worthiness had to be earned through service to others. These early lessons created what psychologists call a fawn response, a survival strategy where the child learns to anticipate others' needs and meet them preemptively to avoid rejection, anger, or abandonment. Alexander's goodness became armor against a world that felt threatening and unpredictable. But armor that protected the child became a prison for the adult. Now Alexander's compulsive goodness serves three unconscious functions. It gives him the illusion of control. If he's indispensable, people can't abandon him. It provides social approval that temporarily fills the void where self-worth should be. And most tragically, it protects him from the terrifying possibility of discovering who he might be if he stopped performing goodness and started expressing authenticity. Because authentic Alexander might have opinions that upset people. Authentic Alexander might want things that seem selfish. Authentic Alexander might need to set boundaries, make demands, or God forbid disappoint someone who's counting on his endless accommodation. And that possibility terrifies him more than the slow death of remaining forever good, forever overlooked, forever burning with resentment he's not allowed to feel. Machiavelli understood something that modern people-pleasers refuse to acknowledge. Power isn't evil, but powerlessness absolutely is. When good people refuse to claim power, they don't eliminate power from the equation. They simply hand it over to those less concerned with good intentions. Alexander's refusal to be strategic doesn't make him moral. It makes him complicit in his own exploitation and ineffective at creating positive change. Machiavelli wrote that a prince must learn to be both the lion and the fox, strong when strength is needed, cunning when cunning is required. But Alexander has only learned to be the sheep, gentle, predictable, and easy prey for every workplace wolf who recognizes his patterns. The most insidious part of Alexander's good person identity is how it disguises cowardice as virtue. When he fails to advocate for himself, he calls it humility. When he allows others to take credit for his work, he calls it team spirit. When he accepts treatment he wouldn't wish on his worst enemy, he calls it taking the high road. But Machiavelli would see through these noble labels to the fear underneath: the fear of conflict, the fear of rejection, the fear of having to fight for what he wants instead of hoping someone will kindly give it to him. Real goodness, Machiavelli understood, requires the power to implement it. A good person without power is just a victim with better marketing. A good person with power can actually change the world, protect others, and create the conditions where goodness isn't just a pretty ideal, but a lived reality. The question isn't whether Alexander should abandon goodness. The question is whether he's brave enough to claim the power necessary to make his goodness matter. Alexander's awakening came during a team meeting, where his latest project, a campaign he'd worked on for 6 months, was being presented by his colleague Sarah, who had joined the project only 2 weeks earlier, but had positioned herself as the lead. As Sarah took credit for Alexander's strategic insights, his creative concepts, and his client relationship building, something inside Alexander finally snapped. Not into anger, but into clarity. For the first time in his adult life, Alexander saw the pattern. With brutal honesty, he wasn't being kind. He was being used. He wasn't being good. He was being taken advantage of. He wasn't being virtuous. He was being a volunteer victim in other people's success stories. When the meeting ended, and Sarah was congratulated for Alexander's work, instead of his usual gracious smile and self-deprecating comment, Alexander did something revolutionary. He spoke up, not aggressively, not emotionally, but with calm, unshakable authority. I appreciate Sarah's contribution to the presentation, but I want to make sure the record reflects that the core strategy, creative direction, and client relationship were developed over the past 6 months through my direct leadership of this project. The room fell silent, not because Alexander was being difficult, but because they had never heard him claim ownership of his own achievements. His manager, caught off guard, actually confirmed Alexander's account. Sarah, suddenly exposed, couldn't deny the timeline, and Alexander realized that standing up for himself hadn't destroyed relationships. It had commanded respect. The difference in how people treated him for the rest of that day was immediate and unmistakable. Not because he had been mean, but because he had finally been real. I want you to pause and examine your own relationship with goodness. When you think about the times you felt most powerless, most overlooked, most taken for granted, how often were you being good instead of being honest? How many opportunities have you lost because you were too nice to fight for them? How many relationships have drained you because you were too good to set boundaries? Here's the deeper question Machiavelli would ask. What would you do if you cared more about being effective than being liked? What would you say if you cared more about being respected than being approved of? What would you claim if you cared more about results than reputation? Sometimes we don't realize that our goodness isn't protecting others from our selfishness. It's protecting us from our own power, our own standards, our own right to expect better treatment. Comment below and share one area of your life where being good has actually made you less effective. Don't worry about sounding selfish. Your honesty might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to give themselves permission to stop sacrificing their lives on the altar of other people's comfort. Machiavelli's approach to effectiveness wasn't about abandoning values. It was about learning to protect and advance them strategically. Alexander began studying what Machiavelli called virtù, not virtue in the modern sense, but the skillful ability to respond appropriately to circumstances, whether that required gentleness or firmness, cooperation or independence, generosity or boundaries. Alexander started practicing what he privately called strategic goodness. Instead of reflexively saying yes to every request, he began evaluating requests based on mutual benefit instead of automatically taking on extra work. He started delegating and requesting resources instead of absorbing all criticism. He learned to respond with facts and redirect responsibility to appropriate parties. This wasn't about becoming mean, it was about becoming intelligent. Alexander discovered that most people actually respected him more when he had standards, worked with him more effectively when he set clear expectations, and trusted him more when he was honest about limitations, rather than promising impossible outcomes to avoid disappointment. The shift wasn't dramatic because Alexander wasn't becoming a different person. He was becoming a more complete version of himself. He was still helpful, still collaborative, still genuinely concerned with others' well-being. But now his helpfulness came from strength, rather than weakness. His collaboration included his own needs rather than erasing them, and his concern for others included healthy concern for himself. 6 months after Alexander's breakthrough, his professional and personal life had transformed in ways he never anticipated. Not because he had become ruthless, but because he had become real. At work, Alexander's new approach to boundaries and ownership led to recognition he had never received through endless accommodation. When he started claiming credit for his contributions, others began noticing the quality and scope of his work. When he began setting realistic expectations instead of promising miracles, his reliability became a strategic advantage rather than a taken-for-granted assumption. Most importantly, when he started advocating for his own advancement instead of hoping someone would notice his dedication, he was promoted to senior project manager with a 30% salary increase. His manager told him the promotion had been obvious for months, but they had been waiting for Alexander to show that he wanted leadership responsibility by actually leading. In his personal life, Alexander's relationships became more authentic and satisfying. Friends who had grown accustomed to him being endlessly available initially protested his new boundaries, but those who respected his growth remained, while those who had been using him gradually faded away. Alexander realized he had been so afraid of losing people through authentic self-expression that he had never discovered who would actually stay when they met the real him. The quality of his connections improved dramatically when quantity stopped being his primary measure of social success. Alexander's transformation reflects patterns that Machiavelli observed throughout human societies. The good people who refuse to claim power don't eliminate power struggles. They simply ensure that less conscientious people control the outcome. This dynamic plays out everywhere. The ethical politician who won't engage in strategic communication loses to the manipulative candidate who understands influence. The principled entrepreneur who won't compete aggressively loses market share to competitors who understand business warfare. The caring parent who won't set firm boundaries raises children who struggle with respect and self-discipline. Machiavelli's insight wasn't that good people should become bad people, but that good people must become effective people if they want their goodness to matter in the real world. The tragedy of the perpetually good person isn't that they fail to achieve their goals, it's that they fail to protect the values they claim to cherish. When good people remain powerless, cruel people face less resistance. When kind people avoid conflict, unkind people face fewer consequences. When generous people refuse to be strategic, selfish people encounter less competition. Machiavelli understood that moral people have a moral obligation to be effective, because ineffective good intentions accomplish nothing except making the person holding them feel virtuous while the world burns around them. True virtue, in Machiavelli's framework, requires the wisdom to distinguish between situations that call for gentleness and those that demand strength, the courage to act appropriately, regardless of how others judge your choices, and the strategic thinking necessary to protect and advance the values you actually care about. Learning to balance authentic goodness with strategic effectiveness requires constant recalibration and conscious choice-making. Alexander still feels the pull of his old people-pleasing patterns, especially during high-stress situations or when dealing with particularly manipulative personalities who know how to trigger his helpful instincts. The difference now is that he recognizes these moments as decision points rather than automatic responses. Alexander developed what he calls his Machiavelli moment. Before responding to any request or challenge, he pauses to consider, is this situation calling for the lion's strength, directness, protective boundaries, or the fox intelligence, strategy, careful navigation of complex dynamics? This isn't about becoming calculating or manipulative, it's about becoming consciously responsive rather than unconsciously reactive. The goal isn't to abandon genuine care for others, but to ensure that care includes healthy care for himself. That isn't to eliminate cooperation, but to make sure cooperation benefits all parties rather than just enabling others while depleting himself. Isn't to become selfish, but to recognize that healthy selfishness actually enables more genuine generosity because he's giving from abundance rather than depletion. Alexander learned that sustainable goodness requires the power to maintain it. Authentic kindness demands the strength to protect it, and real virtue necessitates the strategy to implement it effectively in a complex world where good intentions alone change nothing. Here's what Machiavelli understood: that most good people refuse to accept your niceness. Isn't protecting others from your selfishness. It's protecting you from your own power, and that protection is exactly what's keeping you weak, overlooked, and ineffective at creating the changes you claim to want in your life and the world. The world doesn't need more nice people. It has plenty of nice people who accomplish nothing while feeling virtuous about their ineffectiveness. The world needs more good people who understand that goodness without power is just weakness with better marketing. Kindness without boundaries is just enabling disguised as compassion. Virtue without strategy is just naive idealism that changes nothing. Your people-pleasing isn't making you a better person, it's making you a more convenient person for others to use while contributing nothing meaningful to the causes and people you actually care about. Starting today, I challenge you to practice what Machiavelli called virtue, strategic virtue, that gets results rather than just good intentions. Choose one area where your goodness has made you ineffective and experiment with being strategically authentic instead of reflexively accommodating. Set one boundary you've been avoiding because it might upset someone. Claim one achievement you've been letting others take credit for. Make one decision based on what works rather than what looks nice. In the comments below, complete this sentence: I'm ready to stop being nice and start being effective at what? Don't worry about sounding selfish. Machiavelli understood that people who care about results are infinitely more valuable than people who care about appearances. Subscribe if you're ready to explore more uncomfortable truths about power, authenticity, and the courage to be effective rather than just acceptable. Because the world has enough good people who change nothing. It needs more strategic people who actually improve things.